Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Pep Talks Uncut. We're a 30-minute program sponsored by the Pennsylvania Equality Project. It's an unscripted, unedited program that we share comments and thoughts and questions that impact the LGBTQ community, whether that's in our past, our present, or our future. Today on our show, we have a very special guest joining us. I don't think he needs an introduction, but some of you might know him, might not know him. So without further ado, the one and only Senator Daylin Leach. Senator, thank you for being on the show.
Thank you, David. First of all, there's no need to call me Senator. Daylin is fine. I'm dorky enough without being called Senator. I'm told I'm allowed to keep that title for the rest of my life, but you know, I was never comfortable being called anything, actually. But you know, glad to be with you. Hope I can provide some insight today. And as you can see, I'm in my kitchen. You know, hopefully everyone can hear me okay. And you know, look forward to providing whatever insight I can.
Great. So let's roll the clock back to around 1993, 1994. Back in 1993 and 94, you ran a local political debate television show called Lehigh Valley Firing Line. What was all that about?
It was actually the original name was Lehigh Valley Crossfire. And if you remember, there was a national show called Crossfire on CNN at the time. And I was sure we were going to be sued, but we never were. So God bless America. The show is actually on for 10 years. It started in the 80s. And the format was when I started, the mayor of Allentown, then the ex-mayor of Allentown, Joe DiDona, was the host, the moderator of the show. There was me on the left, and there was an opponent on the right. For a number of seasons, it was a different opponent depending on the topic. And then eventually, we got a steady opponent on the right for me, and we would debate issues of the day. And there would be it was filmed, it was shown live initially, and so there would be telephone calls, people calling in with questions or comments or demands that I never be on television again or whatever it was, and we debated. I mean, over 10 years, we probably did a couple hundred shows. We debated every topic you can imagine, and it's funny. Up until I haven't been back there since before COVID, but even 15 years after the show ended, I'd be walking down the streets of Allentown and someone would approach me and say, "You're that guy on that show." So I was shocked that people actually watched it, but they did, and it was a lot of fun to do, and it really sort of honed my ability to debate. It served me well in the legislature.
Your career in the legislature came beginning in what, 2004?
2000. No, I was elected. Well, I was elected in 2002 to the House. Okay. I was first chosen in a stunning surprise to everyone, including me, to run in a special election in February of 2002. What happened was the incumbent state representative was a woman named Connie Williams, who was the first Democrat elected from that district since the Civil War. There was a state senator named Richard Tillman who was in his late 80s, and he retired in the middle of his term, actually shortly after a hard-fought re-election. He then lived for like 10 more years. But anyway, he retired, so there was a special election to fill his seat, Connie Williams versus Lita Cohen, and who were both state reps from that area. And it was a very hard-fought, kind of contentious race. They later became great friends, and I became great friends with both of them. But Connie was not supposed to win that race. Dick Tillman was a Republican. It had been a Republican seat forever. But Connie pulled it out. The district was changing. And so there was a vacancy for state rep. And when there's a vacancy, there's not a primary. The party just picks somebody. And so I applied. I was a rank carpetbagger. I mean, I just lived there for a couple of years at that time. I thought there was no chance I'd be picked. But I thought, it's good exposure to go through the process. But somehow they picked me. And I actually lost the special election. It was February 12th. We were the only thing on the ballot on a 20-degree day. And no one knew why the hell there was an election that day, and like, I don't know, 30 people showed up or something. And I lost in a very close race, but then I ran in the rematch in November. And that was a much bigger turnout because people knew there was an election in November. Ed Rendell was running for his first term as governor. He was very popular in my area. And so I won the rematch. And so that was November of 2020. I mean, 2002 that I was elected.
Okay.
I hope that was a long-winded enough answer for you.
It certainly was. And now I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but I had a teaching career prior to this program and prior to our organization. And in my teaching career, I used to take students from Northwest Pennsylvania to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington.
Yeah.
And I did that largely because I wanted them to learn about Germany's what they did during World War II and the reasons for that and how we're able to fight or combat against it, especially now that the players have changed. So anti-Semitism, wherever we see it, needs to be called out, needs to be addressed. Was there a problem with anti-Semitism in one of your campaigns back then?
Yes. So my very first campaign, there was a guy. So I was a lawyer before I was elected to the House. I had a case where I represented a guy who used a Jewish slur in a deposition or something obscure. And someone posted about that online, and online was a relatively new thing. So so there was my opponent and her team it was a very Jewish district. It was, Lower Merion and some very Jewish areas.
Mm-hmm.
So they tried to create the campaign issue that I was an anti-Semite. Now, obviously that I vehemently denied that, and I had a pretty good case to make, given that I was bar mitzvahed as an Orthodox Jew, and I've been a practicing Jew all my life. They didn't know that because my last name was Leach, and that really wound up backfiring on them. But I will tell you, the last, it was a very nasty campaign against me. The last weekend of the campaign is the Saturday is usually the last mail date of a campaign.
Mm-hmm.
And usually you try to finish up on a positive note. You may be slinging mud for months, but then you try to finish up something nice about yourself. Not my opponent. They sent. I got home from door knocking the Saturday before the election. I opened up my mailbox. There was a rolled up piece of mail, a giant black postcard. I opened it up, and it said, the headline was Nazis, anti-Semites, and something else. And Daylin Leach thinks it's all a big joke. And they were basically calling me a Nazi sympathizer, which, again, against a Jewish candidate in a state rep race in Pennsylvania was beyond the pale. And we were very aggressive in countering that. And then I think it cost them a lot of votes. But that was my introduction to electoral politics in Pennsylvania.
And then you stayed in the House through 2008, January of 2009?
Yeah, in 2008. So I served 3 terms in the House. And then in 2008, Connie Williams retired. So she'd served 6 years in the Senate. That was enough for her. And so she retired. And so I ran for her Senate seat, and I did prevail in that race. Another charming race, but I did prevail in there. So I was elected to the Senate in 2008. It was a good year to run as a Democrat, because it was the year of Obama's election, and that caused a huge turnout of Democratic voters. But I won by like 30 points at the end of the day. So it was, that's when I entered the Senate.
Okay, well, and it's a good thing you did, because there's a number of pieces of legislation which you either introduced or you spearheaded. Among them was a law that was way ahead of its time, really, and that is pushing for cannabis legalization. So we hear a lot about that with John Fetterman, the lieutenant governor currently, but it was surprising for many in the cannabis community to hear that a state senator is speaking up in favor of cannabis legalization, and now it seems to be pretty massive. Would you say you were ahead of your time?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, I always was for cannabis legalization since I thought prohibition was a cruel, heartless, irrational, destructive policy since I was probably 14 years old. However, it wasn't a front burner issue for me because, frankly, for a long time, there was no realistic chance of making any progress on that issue. However, the wind started to shift a little bit, and I saw, I started thinking maybe we can make some progress on this. And then I met a woman who went to her own state senator because her child had something called Dravet syndrome, a very serious form of epilepsy, and was those kids often don't live into their teen years and are having seizures all day long. And there was a cannabis-based product called Charlotte's Web, named after a girl named Charlotte Figi in Colorado, that had shown some promise in ameliorating the effects of this horrible disease. And this woman, obviously, as any parent would, desperately wanted to have this opportunity for her own child. And it was illegal in Pennsylvania. In fact, if she was caught giving it to her child, she could lose her child. And like, she was so desperate. And I promised her that, I was so upset. I said, look, this is the time for this. And so I promised her that I would get it legalized in Pennsylvania. And I remember leaving the meeting and thinking, okay, genius, how are you going to do this? I'm a liberal Democrat in a Republican-controlled legislature. Pennsylvania is not a very forward-moving state on a lot of social issues, and it seemed very daunting. So I came up with after a lot of thought and meeting with my staff, we came up with a strategy that passed, and there were fits and starts to it, but we ultimately did. And I think we have the best medical program in the country. And then I introduced the first recreational, or the formal term in the cannabis world is adult use bill, Senate Bill 350, because again, the prohibition, destroys people's lives in so many ways, and we see what's happened in states where they've gotten rid of it, and they're all making a ton of tax money. It's longer having to buy products, behind cannabis products behind the bowling alley, where it's not been tested. They don't know the potency. They don't know if it has mold or other dangerous things in it. So, there's just so many reasons that I really decided to focus on that issue. And now that I'm out of the Senate, I've been spending almost all of my working time in cannabis or cannabis-related activities, including what I'm sort of pushing ahead on now, which is psychedelics, or what is also called entheogens. Things like psilocybin, peyote, LSD, MDMA, things that turns out, studies are showing, are very good for treating things like depression, helping people get off of addiction, other sorts of disorders, PTSD. And so, and again, the only reason those are illegal are the same irrational reasons that marijuana was illegal. So, these are hallucinogens, they're intoxicants, they should be regulated, but this sort of like treating them as if they are like the devil and just making criminals out of people has never been the answer. And so I've been spending a lot of time working on that, and I think that I find that very rewarding.
A subject near and dear to my heart at the time I started the organization was marriage equality. And as I recall, you were the one senator we could always count on to introduce legislation in the Pennsylvania Senate that would have made marriage equality the law of the land. And so,
yeah,
thank you.
Introduced it. Yeah, well, thank you. I thank you for mentioning that. I introduced the state's first marriage equality bill. I remember leaders in my own party were like, "You can't do this. What are you doing?" Like it was not acceptable yet to do that. And I did it for, again, if you would ask me when I was 12, I would have always said, well, of course, gay people should be able to get married. But it was not considered like a doable thing until much later. And I didn't introduce this because I thought it would pass as opposed to marijuana. I thought I could get marijuana passed. I didn't think it was ready to get this passed in Pennsylvania. But so I was advocating for it, but I didn't introduce legislation until one day I was watching a television show where they were discussing it. They had just passed something in Hawaii, and they were discussing it, and they were showing the states, like in yellow and blue, like the blue states, had no bill, and that was almost all the states. And the yellow states were the states where there was legislation pending which would legalize marriage equality. And Pennsylvania was not a yellow state. And I thought, well, I can fix that. I can just introduce a bill. It'll turn yellow. And then at least gay people in Pennsylvania will know someone's fighting for them. Because if they just I remember looking at the TV and I'm like, if I were a gay person in Pennsylvania, I would look at this and say, there's not one legislator in Pennsylvania who's willing to fight for me. And so I thought that was really bad. I have a great story, if you have a minute, about, because before Obergefell ultimately made, the Supreme Court made same-sex marriage the law of all of the land. There was actually in 2004 a big effort by the National Republican Party to pass anti-marriage constitutional amendments in states, right? So you couldn't pass a law in the future legalizing same-sex marriage. And there was one in Pennsylvania, and everyone was sure it was going to pass. And I'm very proud of a few things I did in my career. And one of them is I came up with a very creative way, and we stopped that bill. And I'll tell you that if you have a minute, which is that, so there was a bill in the House, and I led the fight against it, a constitutional amendment. It was a horrible bill, which not only prohibited marriage, but prohibited any governmental entity, county, commission, township, supervisors, from recognizing same-sex couples in any way. You couldn't even have domestic partner benefits or, healthcare benefits or anything. You couldn't recognize it in any way. And it was awful. And I passionately spoke against it, but we lost that fight. It passed the House. The Senate then passed, and remember, it has to pass the House and the Senate, the same bill, right? The same way, same language. The Senate passed one banning marriage between same-sex couples, but not banning the other things, not banning municipalities from doing, domestic partner, whatever. So there was a difference between the House and the Senate. So the Senate version came back to the House, and so if we had passed that in the House, it would have passed, right? And so I've had an idea of how to stop it, because I was so passionate against, any of these bills on the floor. I had a lot of credibility, not only with the supporters of same-sex marriage, but with the opponents. I mean, they knew I really meant it, that I was really for marriage equality. They didn't like it, but they knew that I was very strongly in favor of it. So I said, I have an idea. You're going to have to be patient with me, I said, but you may not like what I do, but I think it can work. So they were having a big debate in the House among the Republicans about whether the Senate bill was strong enough to run in the House, whether they should run that and pass it or not, and just say, that's basically screw you to the Senate and whatever. So I said, I sent around a memo to all of the House members, Democratic and Republican, and I said, while I still support marriage equality, the Senate bill isn't as bad. And I used very explicit, almost offensive language. I said, it still allows domestic partnership benefits. In other words, it still allows the government to recognize and give benefits to two men having sex with each other, And I was like, and it worked like a charm. The leading opponent of marriage equality, a guy named Daryl Metcalf, took my email, went into the Republican caucus and said, look, Daylin Leach even thinks the Senate bill's not a bad bill. We can't pass this. And they didn't pass it. And so we sort of led them into a trap, and we stopped them from passing that bill. And so I was very proud of that. Ultimately, Obergefell, changed everything in 2013, 14, but we're not home free, because the Supreme Court's very different than it was then now. I can see them weakening or even overruling that precedent. And if they do that, like abortion rights, there will be states, and Pennsylvania may be one of them, depending on who the next governor is, that immediately that rushes to pass legislation. I mean, there have been 240 anti-LGBT bills introduced just this session nationwide. So there's a real push to do. Most of them have been anti-transgender bills, but there's been all kinds of, and there's, the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida, which people are maybe following. So there's a real an element of America that is still very hostile to the idea of LGBT rights.
Well, you've certainly summarized that time period very well. I recall back then marching on the state capitol in Harrisburg, marching across the steps, seeking marriage equality. Was one of the first large rallies that was held in Harrisburg in a very long time on that topic, if not the only one. So we're pretty proud of that. But you obviously had other, Senator, Daylin, I'm sorry, you had other legislative pieces that you were very proud of and still are very proud of. What was your legislative agenda's shining star? What stands out?
Well, I mean, I do think the marijuana bill is probably my greatest achievement, because that is literally saving lives. And there's not much we do in Harrisburg that actually saves lives. And it's ameliorating and reducing suffering for hundreds of thousands of people now. So I don't know that there's anything I could have done short of my World Peace Bill, which didn't pass, which would have, had more of an impact. So that'll always be number one. But another series of bills that I passed on human trafficking also are saving lives and easing suffering. I was first educated again, always obviously against human trafficking, but it wasn't a front burner issue when I first got to the legislature. Then one day, a woman named Julie Janowski, who worked for something called the Polaris Project, came to my office, just a regular. I had a lot of meetings over the years with people with various issues would come and they talk to me about their issue, and either I could be helpful or I couldn't, or whatever we talked about. But she came and I was just captivated. I had no idea the extent to which human trafficking was widespread, and to the extent to which a lot of it was centered in Pennsylvania, because we're such a crossroads of the East Coast, and how, pervasive it is. There's labor trafficking, there's sex trafficking, but like, it's human slavery essentially, and it is, and it involves children, and it's just terrible. So I like the pot bill. I left the meeting like, we're going to fix this, and at the time, Pennsylvania was like one of the worst states in the country in terms of human trafficking legislation, and we worked hard and we passed 3 big bills that made us now one of the best in the nation in dealing with human trafficking. And they were surprisingly, not every aspect of them, but they were surprisingly controversial. The most controversial aspect of it was something called safe harbor, where we would arrest people, especially juveniles. We would arrest 16-year-olds on the street and charge them with prostitution because they were engaged in prostitution. But very few 15 and 16-year-olds like sit down with a yellow legal pad and weigh out career options and decide prostitution is the way to go. They're almost always victims of human traffickers. But human traffickers are hard to catch and they're hard to convict, because they always say, well, look, when this woman was out on the street, or this girl was out on the street, I wasn't anywhere near her. She could have gone home. She could have called her parents. She could have called the police. Not my fault. And so, and that does not take into account the psychological torture that some of these people are through. And I go through stories, I know we don't have a lot of time, but that really are heart-rending stories of how they take these. Just one real quick one. There was one girl who was a runaway, and they came to her and they wanted her to go out in the street, and she refused. And they beat her up, and she still refused. And so she had a dog that she loved, this dog, and they started beating up the dog. And finally, that brought her out on the street. And it's horrible stuff. So my bill was that you could not prosecute children for prostitution, period. There was a presumption that they were victims of human trafficking. And the DAs opposed it, and they were like, we're doing them a favor by prosecuting them. And I was like, no, you're not. Okay. And but anyway, long story short, and it is a long story, with the help of Senator Stuart Greenleaf, who was a great friend of mine, Republican from Bucks County, and co-chair of the Judiciary Committee with me, we passed the Safe Harbor bill. So the human trafficking stuff is really, really important to me. And we also did a number of other things involving criminal justice reform. We have way too many people in jail for way too long, in conditions that do not make them safer or better citizens when they get out, as 98% of people in jail do. So there's still a lot more to be done on criminal justice reform, but we did some really important things there. And then there were some important bills I introduced that didn't pass or haven't passed yet, but that I think it was important to get the conversation started. I enjoyed controversy. That was a unusual gene. When there was only 2 years I was in the majority in either house, in 2006 to 2008 in the House. And when you're in the majority, you get to set the agenda, right? So we were deciding what bills we would pass. And the most common question in caucus was, why are we running this bill? It's controversial. It's going to, cause me problems at home. Let's just vote on recognizing the woodchuck's contribution to Pennsylvania's heritage and go back to our districts. And I always was the opposite. I wanted to do the most, because the most controversial things tend to be the things that are most needed. And so there was a number of things, from death with dignity to ending the death penalty, to a number of other things that I did that at least got the conversation started, and at least started the debate and moved us down a time. Both of those things will eventually happen, but they won't. My job was to make them happen sooner, and so hopefully, at the end of the day, we'll have done that.
So you mentioned the death penalty, and I believe it was Governor Tom Wolf who implemented a moratorium on the death penalty. And I think that that was sorely needed because a person's innocence may very well be proven long after a criminal trial, and everybody deserves a chance to have new evidence brought to light, I think.
Yeah, there have been a couple, not only death penalty cases, but in a wide variety of criminal cases. There have been hundreds of people who were convicted of crimes and then later exonerated when the DNA was tested and it showed it wasn't them. But keep in mind, in death penalty cases, only about a third of them have DNA available. 2/3 of them don't have DNA at all, so you can't rely on that. So actual innocence is a big problem, that we have an imperfect system, which is, we're human beings, and it's imperfect for a number of reasons. But we have an imperfect system, and we're going to convict innocent people, and once executing innocent people is horrific. But even beyond, even guilty people, the world has moved away from this. We're the other countries with the death penalty are countries like Iran and China and Russia and Saudi Arabia. These are not countries that we want to be in the same human rights conversation with. All right, the idea that we're going to march people into a room and kill them is just barbaric. Not only that, it's expensive. It costs far more to prosecute death penalty cases and deal with death penalty cases than it does in murder cases where the death penalty is not at issue. And it's it's racially disproportionate. The race of the perpetrator is not the biggest issue. It's the race of the victim. Okay, people are sentenced, black and white, are sentenced to death for killing white people, and they're not sentenced to death for killing black people. I mean, there's just so many things wrong with it. We can do better, and we're moving in that direction, I believe.
Well, Daylin, it has been a real pleasure talking with you, and you've given us so much food for thought. I'd love to extend an invitation for you to return to the show at some later date. We'd love to hear from you again. One last thought, any shot of going back into the political arena?
I think politics is so horrible now. And I never used to say that. I used to speak to kids and I used to say it's a noble profession, whatever. But now it's almost, the way our political system is, it's almost impossible to get anything done. We don't do anything more really at the state or federal level of substance. And it's so nasty. And with social media and campaign finance the way it is, you spend all your time just begging strangers for money, getting called horrible names, and you get there and you just, it's gridlock. I feel like I've done that. I feel like maybe I can have more of an impact outside of the political arena, maybe in the cannabis and psychedelic realm, and I do a lot of writing. And so I'm not just sitting around Harrisburg waiting to vote for hours to vote on bills that are never going to become law. And, it's I don't know. I hate to be cynical about it. Maybe a young person can come along and make a difference in politics, but there's things that are going to have to change structurally for that to happen. And I just feel like that's a long road, and I've already walked it for long enough, I think.
Daylin, again, thank you for being on the show.
Thank you, and I'll be, invite me back anytime. Love to come, and thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome.